There was no roar left in the sky when it ended. Only silence, thick, cold, and absolute. The air hung heavy with ash, and the light that filtered through it was the color of old stone. It was not night, not day, but something in between. A long and endless dusk. In this half-light, the outlines of trees blurred into the horizon, and the world felt smaller, enclosed within its own breath. In that silence, a handful of people sat around a fire. The flames wavered, weak and uncertain, their glow swallowed by a sky that refused to clear. They were wrapped in hides stiff with frost, though they had never known frost before. The ground beneath them, once soft and warm, had hardened into grey dust. Every exhale left a pale cloud in the air. They said nothing. There were no stories to tell that could explain what had happened. No one alive could remember the last true sunrise. Far to the west, the ocean murmured beneath a shroud of smoke. Far to the east, the winds carried a faint metallic scent, the trace of something vast and violent that had torn itself out of the earth. The world had changed, and though no one yet understood it, this was the closest humanity had ever come to disappearing. It began with fire. Somewhere on an island that no longer looked like an island, deep beneath the crust of the earth, molten rock had gathered for tens of thousands of years. Pressure built, slow and invisible, until the ground swelled like the breath of a sleeping giant. The forests above it grew dense. The lakes shimmered in sunlight, and life continued, unaware of the forces rising below. Then, in a moment so brief that no witness could have marked it, the mountain opened. When it did, it tore the sky apart. Columns of ash rose higher than any storm cloud, punching through the upper atmosphere, spreading outward like the unfolding of dark wings. Lightning flickered inside the ash, blue and white, as if the heavens themselves were cracking. Within hours, an entire landscape vanished. Forests flattened, rivers boiled, and the sea turned black with floating pumice. This was not an eruption as we imagine it. This was something far larger, an event so immense that the earth itself seemed to recoil. What had once been a mountain was now a vast, empty wound, a caldera more than 100 kilometers wide. The explosion expelled billions of tons of ash and gas into the air, enough to encircle the planet many times over. The light dimmed. The sun, that constant companion of every living thing, was reduced to a faint disk, blurred and colourless behind a veil of smoke. Days became grey. Nights were darker still. The temperature dropped, slowly at first, then sharply, relentlessly. Across continents, the change came like a creeping tide. The rain stopped. The air grew dry, sharp and cold. Where tropical forests had once thrived, frost began to form on the edges of leaves. Birds fell silent. Herds moved south and kept moving, searching for warmth that no longer existed. The small clusters of humans who lived through that first month could not have known the scale of what had happened. They did not know that the source of their despair lay thousands of miles away, or that what they were enduring would last for years. All they knew was that the world had turned against them, that the warmth they had trusted had vanished. Fire became sacred. They learned to guard it carefully, feeding it with scraps of wood, dried grass, and the remains of ancient trees now buried beneath ash. The glow of flame became a boundary between life and the endless cold beyond. Around it they gathered, their faces lit by a faint orange shimmer. Children stared into it, perhaps wondering if the light would one day return to the sky. Above them, the stars were gone. The constellations that once told stories of migration and memory had disappeared into a ceiling of soot. Only the faintest glimmers of light managed to pierce through. Not enough to navigate by, not enough to offer comfort. For the first time, humanity was truly alone beneath a darkened sky. Time lost its rhythm. Without sunlight to mark the days, weeks blurred together. The land grew unfamiliar. Rivers ran differently. Mountains shifted under the weight of ash. Valleys filled with grey snow. The scent of the world changed too. It carried the bitterness of sulphur and the sweetness of decay. Every breath tasted of stone. Yet somehow they endured. In the midst of catastrophe, a fragile persistence took hold. They scavenged what the dying landscape offered. Roots buried deep in frozen soil. The charred remains of animals that had not escaped the suffocating air. They built shelters from the bones of fallen trees and learned to read the stillness of the wind. It is easy to imagine that they lived in fear. Perhaps they did, but more likely they lived in rhythm, the slow, instinctive beat of survival that has guided life since its beginning. When there was food, they ate. When there was warmth, they rested. And when the fire burned low, they sat in silence and waited for morning, even when morning never came. It is here, in this quiet endurance, that the story of humanity turns. Because what followed, the years of cold, the ash that fell like endless snow, did not end us. It changed us. The eruption that created this long night is believed to have happened around 74,000 years ago, in a place we now call Sumatra. Its mark still scars the earth, a vast lake, serene and beautiful, resting inside the bones of what was once a volcano. The world has mostly healed, but the memory of it lingers in the stones, in the sediment, and perhaps even in us. For years after the eruption, the earth was trapped beneath a veil of dust. Sunlight scattered weakly through it, never reaching the ground with its full warmth. Temperatures dropped across the globe. Plants struggled to grow, animals starved. The chain of life bent under the weight of its own fragility. Humanity, then only a small species among many, stood at the edge of extinction. Some say the population may have fallen to just a few thousand individuals, scattered, isolated, separated by vast distances of frozen land. If that is true, then every person alive today carries the inheritance of that narrow escape. Each breath, each heartbeat, is a continuation of a fragile line that refused to break. The fire those few guarded became the first promise, that even when the sky falls silent, life finds a way to whisper back. In those long nights, perhaps they told stories. Maybe they spoke of the time before the darkness, when the world was green and the rivers were warm. Maybe they imagined a day when the sun would return and the sky would clear. Storytelling, after all, is an ancient form of survival. It reminds us who we are when everything else is lost, and so they endured. Days passed into months, months into years. The ash began to settle. Slowly, faint traces of colour returned to the horizon. Not bright, not yet, but enough to see the outline of things again. Grass pushed through the grey dust. The air softened. Birds returned. The first clear sunrise after the darkness must have been almost unbearable in its beauty. When they saw it, perhaps they did not cheer. Perhaps they only watched, silent, reverent, knowing how close they had come to losing it forever. The earth breathed again. What had seemed like an ending became a beginning. The long winter eased, and the rhythms of life resumed their quiet dance. From the edges of catastrophe, humanity began to move again, following rivers, tracing coastlines, spreading slowly outward from the warmth of that survival. We do not remember their names, or their faces, or the words they used for light and fire, but we remember the silence that followed, and the resilience that carried us through it. This is where our story truly begins, not in triumph, but in endurance. Because in the ash that blotted out the sun, humanity discovered something greater than strength. It discovered continuity, the stubborn, quiet persistence to live, even when the world turned to stone, and somewhere, beneath that dim and silent sky, as embers glowed against the cold, the first spark of our shared history survived the night. Long before the sky turned grey, the world was warm and full of colour. It was a time when the earth still breathed gently, when rivers wound through forests dense with life, and when the horizon seemed endless. The continents were familiar, though different in shape and climate. Africa was the heart of it, green, fertile, alive. There, in scattered valleys and open savannas, our ancestors lived under a sun that felt eternal. It was a quieter world. The nights were filled with the low hum of insects, the distant calls of animals echoing across the plains. Fires flickered at the entrances of small shelters made from branches and hide. Around them, people sat close, speaking in soft tones. Their words were simple, but their meanings deep. Gestures, sounds, and shared glances carried the rhythm of belonging. The air smelled of rain and earth. Herds of antelope moved through the grasses, their hooves pressing temporary marks into soil that had seen countless generations pass. Trees swayed, tall and forgiving. The wind carried with it the scent of fruit, the murmur of water, and the quiet rustle of life. This was the world before the fall, a planet unaware of what slept beneath its surface. Humanity then was not scattered across continents as it is today. There were only small bands, numbering in the hundreds, perhaps thousands, moving slowly through the landscape. They were gatherers and hunters, children of the rhythm of the earth. Their survival depended on observation, on knowing the seasons, the habits of animals, the taste of safe routes, the way a shadow stretched before rain. Each sunrise was both a promise and a challenge. The first light of morning painted the land gold, dew glistened on leaves, and birds announced the day. In these moments, life was fragile but balanced. The people knew hunger, but they also knew abundance. They feared predators, but they understood them too. They did not conquer the world, they lived within it. Across Africa, the early humans followed the patterns of the herds and the migrations of birds. They crossed rivers that no longer exist, rested under trees whose names have been forgotten, and left behind faint traces. Footprints in ancient mud, stones shaped to fit the hand, shards of ochre used to mark the body or the walls of a cave. They were not yet divided by language as we know it, but they shared something older, the instinct to communicate. A cry could warn of danger, a gesture could mean trust. Around the firelight, the first forms of story took shape. Perhaps they spoke of the hunt, of dreams, of spirits in the trees or patterns in the stars. In the darkness, these stories connected them, threads of meaning woven from the silence between heartbeats. Their tools were simple but ingenious. Stones chipped to sharpness, bones carved into points, fibers twisted into ropes. From these small beginnings came everything that would one day build civilizations. But in this age, those inventions were not for mastery. They were for endurance. Each innovation carried the same purpose, to live another day. And yet, even in survival, there was art. On the walls of caves and the surfaces of stones, they left markings that served no direct need. Shapes, lines, handprints, symbols that spoke of curiosity, imagination, and perhaps longing. These gestures suggest something uniquely human, the desire not just to exist, but to be remembered, even by no one at all. The world seemed endless then, untouched and stable. Rain fell with dependable rhythm. Rivers flooded and retreated in cycles that had guided life for millennia. The air was rich, the forests dense, and the plains wide open. To those who lived then, the earth must have seemed eternal. The thought that it could change, that the very sky could one day darken, would have been beyond imagining. In the Far East, across the seas, the island that would one day become Sumatra was thick with jungle. The air there was humid, heavy with the smell of flowers and the call of unseen creatures. Beneath that beauty, hidden deep below the surface, magma gathered silently in chambers of unimaginable scale. The people who lived thousands of miles away would never have known its name. They would never have known it existed. But the earth remembers its own power. While humans moved across the surface, watching the clouds and the animals and the stars, the planet itself was preparing something vast. It was patient. The pressure built slowly, over tens of thousands of years unnoticed. In the balance of that ancient world, a change was coming, quiet, invisible, and absolute. Still, life continued, as it always had. In East Africa, the highlands were cool and green. Water ran clear through the valleys, feeding the roots of tall acacia trees. Small groups camped by these rivers, their fires leaving thin spirals of smoke that rose into clear skies. Children learned to shape clay and mimic the calls of birds. Adults shared meat from a successful hunt, dividing it carefully, every piece a symbol of cooperation and trust. Elsewhere, along the coasts, some began to follow the tides. They learned to gather shellfish, to fish in shallow waters, to read the sea's moods. The ocean offered both food and mystery, a horizon that hinted at other lands, other possibilities. These early steps along the water's edge would one day carry their descendants across the world. But for now, they stayed close to what they knew. The world was large, but it was also intimate, defined by what one could see, hear, and remember. When storms rolled across the plains, they took shelter and waited. When the rains ended, they walked again. Their knowledge was carried not in writing, but in memory, passed from one generation to the next through repetition and care. Each life was a continuation of another. To live was to observe. To survive was to remember. To hope was to look to the horizon and believe that tomorrow would come, just as it always had. It is tempting to think of this time as primitive, but it was not. It was the foundation upon which everything would rest: empathy, cooperation, foresight. The people of this era were already shaping the essence of what it means to be human. Their world may have been smaller, but their minds were vast, capable of wonder and fear, love and loss, just as ours are. They were connected to the earth in ways we have long forgotten, able to sense changes in the wind, to hear the distant call of animals long before they were seen, to feel the approach of rain in the pressure of the air. Theirs was not a world of dominance, but of listening, and so the days passed, seasons turned. The world continued its quiet song of life and renewal. Grass grew tall again after fires. Rivers carved new paths through the soil. Children grew into hunters, hunters into elders, and stories flowed between them like water. The rhythm of existence seemed unbroken. But beneath that calm surface, the planet's pulse was changing. Deep under the islands of the Indian Ocean, magma pressed upward, slowly fracturing stone. Steam rose where none had before. The Earth's crust groaned faintly, as if shifting in its sleep. The signs were there, but too subtle, too distant to be noticed by those who lived by starlight and instinct. Somewhere in the world, as a group of people watched the sun set over an African valley, a faint tremor rippled through the ground thousands of miles away. No one felt it. No one could have understood what it meant. The earth gave no warning that its calm was ending. The people gathered their tools, tended their fires, and rested beneath a canopy of stars. The night was warm, familiar, and alive with the sounds of insects and wind. And yet, somewhere beyond the curve of the horizon, the first particles of pressure had begun to shift. The earliest stirrings of the event that would one day darken their skies and chill their blood. The calm before the storm lasted for years, even generations. The volcano waited. The air remained sweet. Children were born. Songs were sung. The balance held. But the earth was not still. The mountain beneath Sumatra was swelling, inch by inch, too slow for the eye to see, but too powerful to be ignored forever. Its breath was heat, its heart magma. And as humanity lived in the peace of unbroken dawns, the countdown to the unimaginable had already begun. The world before the fall was beautiful, abundant, alive, and filled with quiet confidence. It was a time when every sunrise felt eternal. But eternity was an illusion. Soon, that golden light would fade behind a curtain of ash. The rivers would run cold, the forests would wither, and the small fires that once marked the rhythm of human life would become the last points of warmth in a world undone by its own creation. For now, though they slept beneath gentle skies, unaware that beneath their feet, the earth was already remembering its power. It began quietly, not with thunder or smoke, but with the faintest tremor deep beneath the island. It was a pulse, slow, rhythmic, almost imperceptible, the kind of movement that only the earth itself could feel. The island of Sumatra lay draped in green then, a world of humid air, an endless forest. Rivers coiled through dense vegetation, their banks alive with the sounds of insects and birds. The mornings were heavy with mist, the afternoons bright with the call of cicadas. Volcanoes dotted the horizon, silent but ever present, their peaks lost in cloud. The people who wandered these lands might have looked up at them occasionally, unaware that they stood upon one of the greatest pressure points the planet had ever known. Far below the soil and stone, beneath layers of rock older than any living creature, a vast chamber of molten rock was gathering. It had been building for thousands of years. A slow and patient process. Magma from the mantle rose in pulses, feeding a reservoir that swelled like a buried lung. Each new wave added heat, pressure, and restlessness. The rock above flexed and cracked, releasing faint echoes that sometimes reached the surface as small tremors, barely strong enough to stir the branches of trees. The earth was preparing to breathe fire. Supervolcanoes are not defined by shape or size, but by scale, by the magnitude of what lies waiting beneath them. Most volcanoes, even the largest known today, erupt in bursts of local devastation. They carve landscapes, darken skies, and leave scars visible from space. But a supervolcano is different. It does not simply break the surface. It unravels it. It is an event measured not in days or months, but in millennia of consequence. The Toba caldera in Sumatra was one such place. It sat along the fault lines where the Indian and Eurasian plates met, a region of constant tension. For ages, Magma had been rising from deep within the earth, accumulating beneath the crust, unable to escape. The pressure built slowly, folding the land upward. Lakes changed course, hills lifted by degrees that no one living could notice. To the forests above, life went on as usual. Trees grew, rivers flowed, and animals thrived in the warm tropical air. But inside the earth, something ancient was stirring. At first, the signs were subtle. The ground near the volcano warmed. Springs bubbled with sulfur-rich water. Fumaroles released faint trails of steam that rose like whispers into the canopy. Birds that once nested near the slopes began to disappear, moving deeper into the forest. Animals paused at invisible boundaries, uneasy for reasons they could not understand. The air itself seemed heavier, filled with the scent of minerals and heat. For centuries, these signs came and went, unnoticed, but pressure does not dissipate forever. It seeks release. When magma accumulates beneath the crust, it behaves almost like water, flowing, pooling, finding the weakest points to escape. Yet it is far more powerful. As gases mix within it, as temperature and compression rise, the system becomes unstable. Each new tremor is a warning, each crack a potential escape route. In the heart of Toba, these changes grew increasingly violent. The magma chamber expanded to unimaginable size, perhaps 100 kilometers across, filled with molten rock so hot it glowed even in complete darkness. The crust above it, though many kilometers thick, began to flex under the weight of pressure. The land lifted slightly, like the slow swelling of breath before a sigh. On the surface, the forest remained deceptively calm. The wind moved softly through the trees. Rain fell, heavy and warm, pooling in the soil. Beneath that stillness, the earth's crust was straining to contain its own fury. The science of what followed can be described simply: pressure exceeded resistance. But the reality of that balance is vast, a contest between forces beyond comprehension. When a supervolcano reaches its breaking point, the crust can no longer hold the immense volume of molten rock beneath it. The result is not a mountain exploding outward, but the collapse of an entire region downward. The land caves in as the magma chamber empties in a matter of hours or days. What begins as a fracture becomes a wound hundreds of kilometers wide. The energy released in such a moment surpasses every eruption in recorded history combined. This was the path Toba was following. Somewhere deep underground, the first rupture formed, a narrow crack, a sudden vent for gases trapped under immense weight. The pressure dropped locally, causing magma to surge upward in response. The movement triggered new cracks, each larger than the last. Within hours, a chain reaction began, linking fractures across the entire caldera. To those living far away, it might have started as a faint vibration underfoot, a single tremor that rolled across the land and faded. Perhaps they paused, listening, waiting for silence to return. It did, but beneath them, the system continued to unravel. The first explosions came soon after. Vents opened across the landscape, releasing towering plumes of ash and gas. The air shimmered with heat. Forests ignited. Rivers boiled. And yet, this was only the beginning, the earliest breath of a catastrophe still gathering its full force. The magma continued to rise, forced upward by the collapsing roof of the chamber. With every kilometer it ascended, its gases expanded, multiplying its power. The result was inevitable. The mountain was ready to break. Before it did, there was stillness, a pause that often comes before great release. The tremors stopped. The air grew unnaturally calm. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment, the island might have seemed at peace again, wrapped in the quiet of early morning mist. But beneath that calm surface, the crust was fracturing along its entire length. The earth was holding its final breath. Supervolcanoes, by their nature, rewrite landscapes. When they erupt, they do not leave behind a cone or a crater. They create calderas, vast depressions where the surface collapses into the emptied space below. Toba's caldera would one day stretch more than 100 kilometers long and nearly 30 kilometers wide. Within it, the magma would release an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, ash, pumice, and gas thrown into the stratosphere. Numbers can only hint at what that means. Imagine every mountain, every valley within a region the size of a small country, disassembled and thrown skyward. Imagine ash so dense it circles the globe, falling for weeks in lands that have never known its touch. The eruption that was about to unfold would change the atmosphere itself, altering climate, light, and life for years to come. And yet, in the moments before it began, the forest was still. Perhaps the animals felt it, an instinctive unease, a vibration too deep for the ear to hear. Birds would have taken flight in silent waves, their wings cutting through the dense air. Elephants and deer might have moved toward rivers, their steps hurried but confused. Beneath the soil, roots trembled, rocks shifted, and water turned to steam. The islands seemed to hum faintly, like the sound of something vast awakening. In those final hours, the heat rising from the ground would have been enough to wither leaves and dry the air. Fumaroles vented steam in white plumes. The ground cracked open, releasing bursts of gas that shimmered in the sunlight. Then, as the pressure reached its peak, the balance that had held for millennia gave way. The earth broke. What followed would defy all human comparison. An eruption that dwarfed every storm, every earthquake, every fire that had ever touched the land. The island that had been lush and green would vanish beneath its own fury. But that moment, that violent birth, was still a heartbeat away. For now, in the quiet before the storm, the world was suspended between stillness and destruction. Beneath the calm forests of Sumatra, the heart of the earth was pounding, slow and deep, preparing to release its greatest exhale. The sky above was clear. The rivers still flowed. Life moved, unaware, across a surface, ready to give way. And in that silence, in that fragile pause between peace and catastrophe, the mountain waited. Soon, it would no longer be a mountain. It would be a wound, a mark the planet would carry for the rest of its life. At first it was only a sound, a low, distant rumble that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It rolled beneath the ground like thunder moving through stone. Birds burst from the trees, their wings flashing against a sky still pale with morning light. The air trembled. Leaves shivered on their branches. Then came another sound, deeper and longer, as if the island itself had taken a breath and was struggling to exhale. For a heartbeat, there was stillness, a pause that carried the weight of the Earth's hidden forces. And then, the mountain broke. The first explosion tore upward through the crust, releasing a column of fire and ash that climbed into the sky with impossible speed. It rose higher and higher, driven by the sheer violence of escaping gas, until it reached the edge of the stratosphere and spread outward in a dark canopy. Within moments, the sky was no longer blue. It was grey, then black. Lightning flashed inside the cloud, silent at first, then echoing through the valley in deep rolling waves. The island shook. Entire ridges collapsed as the ground split open along hidden fractures. Jets of molten rock burst from vents miles apart, joining into a single storm of fire. The sound defied description, too vast to be heard, too continuous to be measured. It was not a noise that passed through the air, but a vibration that filled every space, every body, every living thing. Rivers of lava surged down the slopes, igniting forests in seconds. Trees that had stood for centuries vanished into flame. The rivers hissed and boiled where molten rock met water, sending plumes of steam high into the darkened air. The eruption of Toba had begun in full. Over the next hours, the earth released its stored fury. The caldera's roof collapsed inward, pulling whole mountains down with it. Valleys folded, lakes evaporated in an instant. The temperature around the eruption site rose far beyond what life could endure. Every gust of wind carried ash, hot and sharp, sweeping through the forests in grey waves. The power of the eruption can scarcely be imagined. It expelled an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material, ash, pumice, and molten rock, enough to cover entire continents in a thin, choking layer. Compared to it, every eruption of recorded history would seem like a breath against a storm. The eruption column reached 40 kilometers into the atmosphere, where the air is thin and cold. There, it spread outward in a vast umbrella of ash and gas that began to drift across the world. Sulfur dioxide mixed with water vapor, forming aerosols that reflected sunlight back into space. The planet's temperature began to fall, though no one yet alive could know it. On the ground, the world was unrecognizable. For hundreds of kilometers around the caldera, The landscape was buried beneath glowing flows of ash and pumice. These pyroclastic currents moved faster than storms, hugging the ground in waves that incinerated everything in their path. They swept across valleys, over rivers, into forests, and out to sea. The ocean itself boiled where they met the water, sending pillars of steam into the air so tall they merged with the ash cloud above. The noise, once deafening, began to blend into a continuous hum, the sound of the planet reshaping itself. Far away, people who had never seen the volcano might have noticed the sky darkening. The sun dimmed behind a curtain of dust. Days turned strange, the light sickly and diffuse. Animals grew restless. The air smelled of sulfur and ash. They could not have known that the light they once trusted was being stolen by a storm of the Earth's own making. Closer to the eruption, there was no distinction between day and night. The air grew heavy, dense with falling debris. Ash drifted like snow, soft at first, then thick and endless. Every surface disappeared under it. Trees, rivers, animals, and the bodies of those who could not escape. The island became a single grey plain of heat and silence. In the heart of the eruption, time lost meaning. Hours blurred into days. The sky, once blue and vast, was a solid mass of smoke and fire. Lightning flickered through it, 1,000 strikes a minute, illuminating the clouds from within. Thunder rolled constantly, an endless chorus of the Earth's release. And then, gradually, the sound began to fade. The violence burned itself out. The lava cooled, the gas thinned, and the columns of ash began to collapse under their own weight. What remained of the island was unrecognizable, a broken, sunken scar where mountains had once stood. The caldera was vast, stretching nearly 100 kilometers, its floor filled with steaming debris and molten lakes. Above it, the ash cloud continued to expand. By now, it had spread across much of the planet, carried by upper winds. Ash fell over oceans, over distant continents, over lands that had never known the name Toba. It settled in layers that would one day be found in ice, in soil, in the quiet pages of geological memory. For the life that survived nearby, there was little to return to. The forests were gone. Rivers had changed their paths. The animals that once filled the land had vanished, their tracks erased by ash. The temperature dropped sharply in the days that followed as sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick haze. Rain turned to mud as it mixed with falling ash. The air, once humid and heavy with the scent of life, now carried only dust. And then came the quiet. After so much noise, the silence was almost unreal. The wind no longer carried birdsong or the rustle of leaves. The only sound was the soft fall of ash, like snow descending endlessly through the still air. The eruption had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. The gases released into the atmosphere would linger for years. Sulfur aerosols would block sunlight, lowering global temperatures by several degrees. Crops would fail. Ecosystems would collapse. Rainfall would shift and falter. Across the planet, the balance that had supported life would teeter. Yet, in that moment, the first calm after the storm, the Earth seemed exhausted, as though it had exhaled completely. To imagine it now is to see the contradiction at its core, a world both destroyed and remade. The eruption obliterated everything near it, but it also shaped the land anew. In time, water would fill the vast depression left behind, forming a lake more than 100 kilometers long. New forests would take root in the ash, their green leaves fed by the very minerals that had ended the old ones. Creation and destruction, bound together, the eternal rhythm of the planet. Far away, where people still huddled in shelters, the darkness deepened. They could not see the source of their suffering, only its reach. The sunlight grew weaker each day. Shadows lengthened even at noon. The air grew cold and the rains no longer came. What had been a world of warmth and abundance was now shifting toward hunger and frost. Still, the memory of the eruption lingered in the air itself. The particles suspended above the world formed a veil that glowed faintly at dawn and dusk, turning the horizon's strange shades of red and gold. To those who saw it, it might have seemed beautiful, though its beauty was born of devastation. The earth had sighed, and for a time it seemed to sleep. In the caldera, steam rose from cracks in the new landscape. The ground hissed with residual heat. Pools of molten rock glowed in the dark, fading slowly as the days passed. Rain returned in sheets, falling onto ash that sizzled as it cooled. The air filled with the scent of minerals and rainwater. Life, cautious and tentative, began its slow return. But the silence endured. The eruption of Toba was more than a natural event. It was a turning point in the story of the planet, a reminder of its immense power and its indifference. The island that once flourished had vanished into history, replaced by a scar so vast it would take tens of thousands of years to fade. And yet, somewhere beyond the horizon, in distant lands where the ash would soon fall, small fires still burned. People gathered around them, their faces dimly lit, unaware of the scale of what had just occurred. They would feel it soon enough. In the cold, in the hunger, in the silence that followed. For now, the earth was still. The sky was black. The world, suspended between ruin and renewal, waited. When the first light of dawn finally touched the edge of the horizon, it was weak and pale, filtered through a sky that could no longer breathe. The day the sky turned black had passed, but the night it left behind had only just begun. In the months that followed the eruption, the world began to dim. The veil of ash and sulfur suspended high above the earth drifted across continents, scattering sunlight before it could touch the ground. Days grew shorter, not by the turning of seasons, but by the thickening of the air. It did not happen all at once. At first, the light merely softened, the warmth fading slightly from the sun's touch. But soon, morning and evening became indistinguishable. Shadows stretched endlessly, the air cooled, the blue of the sky turned to grey, and then to a dull, heavy white. The ash continued to fall. Across Asia and Africa, rain turned to sludge as it mixed with fine volcanic dust. Rivers darkened. The leaves of plants, coated in grey, stopped breathing. The photosynthetic pulse that fed life on Earth slowed and faltered. In the oceans, plankton declined. In the forests, trees withered where they stood. The temperature fell further. It was not a sudden frost, but a long descent. Year after year of growing chill. The winds carried the cold deep into the tropics, reaching places that had never known it before. Grasslands became brittle. Deserts spread, and in the highlands, snow began to fall where rain had once been warm. Somewhere on the eastern coast of Africa, a small group of humans gathered at dusk. They were not many, perhaps a few dozen, perhaps fewer. They had seen the light fade and the animals vanish from their hunting grounds. They had followed the rivers southward in search of warmth, only to find more cold. Now they huddled around a small fire. The flames were faint, the wood damp from the endless grey drizzle. The smoke hung low, curling around their faces. Above them, the stars were gone, hidden behind a ceiling of ash that had not lifted for years. No one alive could remember when the sun had last felt strong. They spoke in low voices, the sound muffled by the wind. Each word carried the weight of a habit and hope, a way to keep the silence from becoming too large. In that darkness, storytelling became survival. Around the fire, they spoke of animals they no longer saw, herds of gazelle, the calls of distant birds, the taste of ripe fruit. They spoke of rivers that once shone under full daylight, of storms that brought water instead of dust. The stories were not only memories, they were instructions for living, how to find warmth, how to find food, how to remember what sunlight felt like. Somewhere else, across the narrow straits of water, other small bands were doing the same. On islands and coasts, in valleys and caves, people shared warmth and words. The numbers were small, unimaginably small. Genetic traces in our own bodies tell the story. At the worst of this volcanic winter, perhaps only a few thousand humans survived. The rest were lost to hunger, cold, or disease. Entire lineages vanished without record. The diversity of the species, built over hundreds of thousands of years, narrowed to a fragile thread. Yet that thread held. They hunted what they could find: small animals, roots, and the occasional fish washed ashore. They learned to trap warmth in shelters made of hides and earth. They kept fire alive not only for heat, but as a promise. In some groups, embers were carried from one campsite to the next, guarded as if they were life itself. In a world where the sun could no longer be trusted, fire became the new dawn. Still, the cold deepened. As the ash and aerosols continued to reflect sunlight, global temperatures fell by several degrees. Glaciers advanced. Even in equatorial regions, frost formed on the edges of leaves. In the highlands, ice spread where once there had been only rain. The wind grew sharp, thin, and endless. Many animals that had once supported early humans began to vanish. The great herds that roamed the plains dwindled. With less vegetation, there was less prey. With less prey, there was hunger. The forests fell silent. For humans, survival became a quiet act of persistence. In the absence of abundance, they turned inward, to cooperation, to memory, to invention. The sharing of food and warmth became essential. Words, still young and fragile in their form, grew more complex as people learned to coordinate, to plan, to hope. Around the fires, the young listened to the old. They memorized paths, plants, and signs in the sky that were no longer visible. They learned from stories what could no longer be seen, and so the species endured, not through strength, but through connection. In the wider world, the ash continued to fall. In some regions, the layer grew meters thick, burying landscapes in a pale shroud. Rivers clogged with sediment. Lakes became acidic. Forests disappeared beneath drifts of fine dust. The planet's atmosphere remained altered for years. The volcanic gases that had risen from Toba's heart circled the globe, scattering light, chilling the air, and changing rainfall patterns. The rhythm of the earth itself seemed to falter. Yet slowly, very slowly, the light began to return. After perhaps 5 or 6 years of near total dimness, the skies began to clear. The ash settled. The aerosols thinned. The faint outlines of the sun appeared once more through the haze. The world remained cold, but the color of the light shifted, from grey to pale gold. For the survivors, this change was not immediate salvation, but it was enough to sustain hope. New shoots appeared in the soil, tentative and fragile. The first green in years, the animals returned in small numbers, cautious, starving, but alive. The rivers began to flow clear again, and with the return of light came something else: memory. In the long dark, humans had not only survived, they had learned to remember, to pass on the story of what had happened. They carried with them a deep awareness that the world could change without warning, that warmth could vanish, that survival depended not on domination, but on care. Around the same fires that had once flickered in despair, new stories took shape. They told of the great dark sky, of the long winter, of the days when the earth itself seemed to sleep, and they told of the endurance of their ancestors, those who refused to let the flame die. These stories would echo down generations, reshaped and retold, until the memory of the supervolcano became myth. Some would speak of floods that covered the land, of endless nights, of a sun that turned away. Beneath every legend of destruction, there lingered a faint shadow of that ancient truth, the time when humanity almost disappeared. As centuries passed, the earth slowly healed. The climate warmed again. Forests returned to the equator. The rains came back. The sky grew blue once more. But the species that emerged into that new light was not the same as the one that had faced the dark. They were fewer, yes, but more resilient, more cooperative, more aware of their own fragility. The genetic bottleneck that had nearly erased them had also bound them together. Every human alive today carries within them the imprint of that narrow survival. We are all descended from those who endured the long winter. Even now the evidence remains in the land. Layers of ash, buried deep beneath lakes and soil, tell the same story in the language of geology. A band of grey, thin, unassuming, marks the moment when the world dimmed and began again. And though we can no longer hear their voices, we can still imagine them. The small fires burning against the endless cold. The quiet songs hummed to children as snow fell where it had never fallen before. For them, the future was unknowable, yet they endured. For us, their endurance is the beginning of everything. The long winter ended, but its memory remains, not in words, but in the blood of every person alive. It reminds us that life can narrow to a single flame, and still that flame can outlast the dark. Firelight against frozen darkness, the fragile warmth that kept a species alive, the quiet truth of our survival. For tens of thousands of years, the memory of the eruption faded from the world. No written record survived. No carved stones, no ancient songs preserved in full. The people who lived through it left only their descendants, and traces of ash buried deep beneath the surface of the earth. For most of human history, that silence went unquestioned. The planet's scars healed, and time moved forward. The lake that filled the Toba caldera became still and blue, ringed with forest. To those who looked upon it in later ages, it seemed peaceful, a place untouched by violence. Only in the modern era would the truth begin to emerge again, piece by piece, from unexpected places. It began not with myth, but with evidence, fragments of glass, layers of ash, and patterns hidden in the human genome. In the depths of the Indian Ocean, researchers studying seafloor sediments noticed something strange. Buried within layers of clay and sand lay a band of pale grey, composed of tiny shards of volcanic glass. These shards were microscopic, remnants of an eruption so large that its dust had settled even across the open ocean. Chemical analysis revealed their origin: Sumatra. The composition matched volcanic material from a single colossal event, an eruption that had taken place roughly 74,000 years ago. This was Toba, reborn in data and stone. Elsewhere, far from the sea, another clue appeared. In the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drilled deep cores that contained the frozen history of the atmosphere. Each layer of ice recorded a year, sometimes a season, preserving air bubbles and traces of dust from the distant past. At a depth corresponding to the same period, they found a sharp rise in sulfur, a signature of volcanic gas injected high into the stratosphere. It was the same fingerprint found on opposite ends of the Earth: a sudden spike in sulfur, a long decline in temperature, a planetary winter frozen in ice. The Earth had kept its own record, silent but precise. While the story of the eruption had vanished from human memory, it remained written in the archives of geology. And then, in another field entirely, scientists began to find echoes of the same event within us. In the late 20th century, as genetic research advanced, scientists mapped variations in human DNA across populations. What they found was puzzling. For a species spread across so many regions, humans were remarkably uniform. The genetic differences between individuals were far smaller than expected for a species of our age and range. The data suggested a bottleneck, a point in the past when our numbers had fallen drastically, reducing genetic diversity to a narrow thread. By analyzing the rate of mutation, they estimated when this bottleneck might have occurred. The answer pointed to the same era as the Great Eruption. Two entirely different sciences, geology and genetics, were whispering the same ancient truth. The planet had nearly erased us. The realization took time to sink in. The volcanic layers in the ocean floor, the sulfur in the ice, the narrowing of genetic diversity, all were clues pointing to a catastrophe that had once reshaped the course of humanity. Each fragment alone told only part of the story. Together, they formed a picture of near extinction and fragile survival. The Toba eruption was not just another event in the planet's past. It was a hinge, a moment when nature's scale eclipsed everything that lived upon it. Scientists began to reconstruct what it might have meant for our ancestors. The eruption's ash cloud, they concluded, had spread across continents, dimming sunlight and plunging the Earth into volcanic winter. Temperatures may have dropped by several degrees. Vegetation would have declined sharply, food sources dwindled, and fragile populations isolated by distance and scarcity. For early humans, already few in number, this would have been a test beyond imagination. Some estimates suggested that the global population might have fallen to fewer than 10,000 individuals. Perhaps fewer still. The evidence was sobering, yet strangely unifying. Every human alive today might be descended from that handful of survivors, the people who endured when the rest of the world went dark. It is a humbling thought that modern humanity, with all its diversity, its languages and its civilizations, arises from a single narrow passage in time, a moment when life could have ended, but did not. Still, not all scientists agreed on the scale of the catastrophe. Some argued that the effects of Toba, while severe, may not have been as apocalyptic as once thought. Ashfall and cooling varied by region. Populations in Africa, though reduced, might have found refuges where warmth and water remained. But even in debate, the essential truth remained. The eruption left its mark everywhere, in the ground, in the ice, and in us. Its echoes are quiet but enduring, carried in the chemistry of the planet and in the code of life itself. To study those traces is to listen to the Earth speak across time. Each data point, each fragment of glass, each strand of DNA becomes a word in a story that spans 74,000 years. Together they form a conversation between the ancient and the modern, between the living and the long gone. In laboratories filled with quiet hums of equipment, scientists now handle the remnants of that distant world. Microscopes reveal the textures of ash. Sequencing machines read the faint variations in genetic code. Through them, the past is not imagined. It is measured, compared, and confirmed. The process is slow, methodical, and deeply human. It is the same instinct that once kept our ancestors alive beside their fires. Curiosity, persistence, the refusal to accept darkness without seeking its cause. Through science, the memory of Toba was not revived as myth, but as knowledge. And yet there is poetry in that precision. In the faintest particles of volcanic glass, one can see the reflection of a lost world. The forests turned to ash. The sky turned black. The small bands of people enduring the cold. In the code of our DNA, one can still trace the narrow bridge they crossed, the moment when the future almost ended. Each of us carries that continuity silently, like the distant echo of a sound once heard and never forgotten. The scientists who pieced together this story did not set out to find tragedy, they found resilience instead. The discovery of our near extinction is not only a reminder of what was lost, but of what endured. The eruption was vast beyond measure, but life, fragile, persistent, human, outlasted it. In that sense, every finding, every data point, is both a revelation and a reassurance. The ash beneath the sea, the sulfur in the ice, the pattern in our genes, all testify to the same paradox, that we are, at once, the most vulnerable and the most enduring of species. The distance between the modern world and that ancient night is immense, yet in a quiet way, the connection remains. Every time a researcher uncovers a new layer of sediment, every time a genome is mapped, the boundary between past and present grows thinner. We are not separate from that event. We are its continuation. The same earth that darkened the skies then still spins beneath our feet. The same fragile breath that survived the ash still moves through our lungs. When we look back upon Toba today, it is with the calm awe of understanding, the ability to hold in mind both destruction and survival, both the terror of nature's power and the wonder of life's persistence. In that balance lies the quiet beauty of science, the transformation of tragedy into meaning, of loss into knowledge. The ash may have settled long ago, but its story still drifts through time, carried not by wind, but by curiosity, memory, and the enduring human need to know where we came from, and how we remained. Ancient tragedy, modern understanding, two sides of the same truth. The earth speaks. At last, we have learned how to listen. Long before the word supervolcano was ever spoken, long before maps or history or writing, there were stories. They were told beside fires, under stars dimmed by distance, passed from one voice to another across generations. In them, the ancient world survived, not as fact, but as feeling. The people who endured the long winter of Toba carried no instruments, no records, but they carried memory. And memory, when it passes through the human mind, becomes story. In many cultures that arose tens of thousands of years later, certain stories repeat. They speak of a time when the sky turned dark, when the sun disappeared, when the earth itself seemed to tremble and die. They tell of floods that drowned the land, of fire that fell from the heavens, of gods who burned the world and began it again. To modern ears, they sound like allegories, yet behind them may lie something older than religion itself. In Indonesia, where Lake Toba now rests within its silent caldera, there are still tales of mountains that once burned with divine anger. Across the islands, myths speak of fire spirits and sleeping giants beneath the earth, beings who can reshape land and sea when disturbed, though the people who tell these stories live thousands of generations removed from the eruption. The echo is familiar: destruction followed by renewal, death followed by rebirth. Far to the west in South Asia, some of the oldest Vedic hymns describe worlds destroyed by fire and smoke, where light itself retreats and returns. The Rig Veda, composed long after Toba, but drawn from older oral roots, tells of darkness that covered all, of the one light born again. Whether by coincidence or inheritance, the pattern remains. A long night, a cleansing fire, a new dawn across Africa. Too, the echoes persist. In East African traditions, regions where our ancestors once sought refuge from the cold, there are tales of a sun that vanished for many days, of a time when the people survived by huddling close to the ground. Some stories speak of a great ash that covered the plains, of ancestors who carried embers to keep the light alive. In these fragments of folklore, the ancient reality seems to glimmer beneath the surface. Fire, darkness, endurance. Even in regions untouched by the direct fall of ash, myths of destruction and renewal are found. From the flood stories of Mesopotamia and the legends of fire gods in Polynesia, to the time of smoke told by certain Australian Aboriginal groups, humanity seems bound by recurring images of world-ending fire and world-renewing dawn. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps these stories are metaphors born from the universal fear of loss and longing for rebirth. But perhaps they are also a form of remembering, not through language or record, but through imagination itself. The human mind does not keep history the way a stone keeps an imprint. It reshapes, simplifies, and layers meaning upon memory. What was once a mountain that exploded becomes a god who grew angry. What was once ash falling from the sky becomes the feathers of a celestial bird. What was once survival becomes a lesson, a reason for reverence or for hope. Storytelling was, and still is, one of the oldest forms of science, a way to explain what could not yet be measured. In the age after Toba, when fire and darkness ruled the world, the act of telling stories may have been what preserved not only memory, but meaning. Imagine for a moment a group gathered around a fire 70,000 years ago. The sky above them is still strange, the stars faint behind a veil of haze. The world has changed, and they do not yet understand how. But around them, in that circle of light, they share words. Someone tells of the mountain that breathed smoke, of the day the sun went away. Someone else adds that the spirits were angry, that they demanded respect. The story becomes a way to make sense of loss, to give shape to fear. Those words, passed down again and again, could travel farther than any map. Through generations, they might transform, from warning to legend, from legend to faith. And by the time they reach the civilizations that would one day rise, the details have faded, but the rhythm remains. Fire, darkness, renewal. There is a quiet beauty in this transformation. What began as terror became teaching. What began as survival became myth. The human mind has always turned suffering into story, and story into strength. When the natural world overwhelms, imagination restores order. It gives chaos a pattern, destruction a reason, and survival a purpose. That gift, the ability to weave experience into meaning, may have been as essential to our endurance as shelter or flame. Even now, echoes of those ancient memories can be found in the myths of creation and apocalypse that thread through so many cultures. The story of a flood that wipes away all life but a few survivors. The story of fire that cleanses the world so it may be born anew. The story of light returning after endless darkness. All speak to a truth older than language, that life continues. The great religions of later ages, too, would inherit this rhythm. In them, fire becomes purification, darkness becomes trial, light becomes redemption. Each is a reflection, refracted through millennia, of a single enduring human instinct, to find meaning in survival. The eruption of Toba, long forgotten in its physical form, may still live within these patterns, not as a direct memory, but as a pulse, faint yet steady, in the human imagination. Across the millennia, the lake that filled the caldera grew calm, forests returned, people settled on its shores, fished its waters and gave names to its stillness. They no longer knew what had happened there. Yet in their myths, the old pattern remained. The sleeping giant beneath the lake, the forbidden mountain, the god who once burned the world. We do not know if these legends truly descend from the survivors of Toba, or if they are coincidences of thought. But perhaps the distinction does not matter, for whether born of memory or metaphor, the story serves the same purpose, to remind us of fragility, to honor endurance, to give voice to the silence of the past. In the quiet language of myth, humanity recorded not only the facts of what was lost, but the feeling of it, the awe, the fear, the gratitude, and that feeling may be the most faithful record of all. When we listen to these ancient stories now, scattered across continents and centuries, we are hearing something more than imagination. We are hearing the way memory survives when written not on paper, but in the heart. It is the same voice that once spoke around the fire when the world was cold and the sky was dark. A voice that says, "We lived through this. We remember fire and darkness, myth and memory, fear and meaning. The boundaries between them blur, but the truth remains. Long after the ash settled, long after the light returned, the human story continued, told, retold, reshaped, and carried forward. In the end, perhaps this is what it means to be human, to endure what cannot be understood and to transform it into story so it may never be forgotten. In the aftermath of catastrophe, the earth grew still, the winds softened, the ash settled into the soil. Across the continents, silence replaced the roar of eruption and storm. But in that silence, life continued. Somewhere along a rocky coastline, a small group of people walked the shore at dawn. The air was cold, the sea grey beneath a pale sky. They searched the tide line for anything that might sustain them. Fish washed ashore, driftwood for fuel, the remnants of a forest that no longer stood. They were not many, perhaps a few families, perhaps only a dozen souls. Their footprints formed fragile trails along the wet sand, soon erased by the tide. Yet within those trails lay the future of a species. For these survivors, endurance was not a single act of strength, but a daily negotiation with the world around them. They built shelters against the wind. They gathered food where little grew. They learned which roots could be eaten, which stones could spark flame, which sounds in the dark meant danger, and which meant home. Theirs was not a triumph in the way history often defines the word. It was quiet, ordinary persistence, the kind that leaves no monument except the continuation of life itself. The cold years that followed the Toba eruption forced adaptation not through conquest, but through connection. No one could survive alone for long. The warmth of a fire, the sharing of food, the presence of another voice. These became the boundaries between life and death. In the caves and coastal refugees where small groups endured, a new rhythm of life took shape. At night, they sat close together, conserving heat beneath furs and woven grass. Children slept between elders, hands touching to share warmth. The fires they built were small but constant, the center around which thought, speech, and memory gathered. Fire had always been useful. Now it became sacred. It was light against darkness, stability against uncertainty. Those who tended it learned to pass on the skill, how to coax sparks from stone, how to keep embers alive through the rain. To teach this was to teach survival. Picture a mother showing her child how to strike flint against pyrite, the brief flash of orange in the gloom. The child watches, repeats, fails, and tries again. When at last the spark catches, the flame becomes not only heat, but heritage, proof that knowledge can outlive disaster. In that act, the essence of endurance is revealed, the sharing of what one knows so another may live. As the world slowly healed, these scattered groups began to move again. The cold still lingered, but the ice retreated inch by inch. Rivers found new paths. Plants began to return in fragile shoots of green. The humans followed, tracing the coastlines where food was more reliable. They carried few possessions, tools, baskets, fire, and memory. But among the most vital things they carried was each other. Anthropologists, looking back, would later see this period as a turning point. The crisis that nearly erased humanity also refined what it meant to be human. Faced with scarcity, people learned to share rather than hoard. Faced with fear, they learned to communicate rather than withdraw. In the frozen dark, empathy became as essential as food. It is easy to imagine survival as a contest of strength, but strength alone could not have saved them. What preserved humanity through the long winter was cooperation, the instinct to gather together, to divide labor, to comfort, to protect. Isolation was fatal. Connection was salvation. In every band of survivors, there must have been those who fell ill, who despaired, who could go no farther. Yet others stayed with them, shared what little they had. The bond between parent and child, between hunter and gatherer, between one fire and the next. These invisible threads became the fabric of endurance. Empathy was not a luxury. It was a strategy. Over generations, this way of living, together, interdependent, compassionate, shaped the path of our evolution. The crisis selected not only for the strong, but for the caring. Those who helped others helped themselves. Those who shared knowledge and resources passed on their way of being to their descendants. In that sense, the Toba eruption did not just test humanity, it shaped it. The cold refined our capacity for cooperation, our ability to imagine the needs of another. From that long hardship grew the roots of language, of culture, of what we now call civilization. Each fire that burned in the darkness was a seed of the future. When the climate began to warm again, these survivors ventured farther. Some followed rivers inland, others crossed narrow sea channels, reaching new islands, new lands. Migration became both necessity and discovery. Every step carried the memory of what had been endured, and the determination not to face such isolation again. By the time sunlight returned in full, humanity had spread wider than before. Small populations, once separated by ice and distance, began to meet again. They exchanged tools, stories, and knowledge, evidence that communication had survived the cold. In this exchange lay the first hints of what would later become culture. Shared understanding passed beyond family, beyond tribe. The fragile thread that connected the survivors had not broken. It had grown longer, stronger, more intricate. In the centuries that followed, as ecosystems recovered and animals returned, humans once again found abundance. But they did not forget the lessons of scarcity, the rituals of sharing, the stories told around fire, the cooperative hunts, all carried echoes of that ancient trial. Even now, in the quiet spaces of our behavior, those echoes remain. The instinct to help, to gather, to comfort. It is not merely moral, it is ancestral. It is the memory of cold nights and fragile fires, carried forward in every generation. When we speak to each other, when we build communities, when we care for strangers, we repeat the same pattern that once kept us alive. This is the true legacy of the eruption, not the destruction it caused, but the resilience it revealed. The species that survived was not the strongest or the fastest, but the most connected. Empathy became evolution's quiet victory. The long winter taught us to rely on more than muscle or instinct. It taught us to imagine, to plan, to feel. It taught us that survival is never solitary, and so, from the smallest acts, a shared ember, a hand extended, a word of reassurance, grew the vast network of human continuity. Every civilization that followed, every culture and language, every story ever told, can trace its lineage back to those few who refused to let isolation define them. Their world was fragile, their numbers few, their future uncertain, but they endured. Not because they conquered the earth, but because they learned to hold each other through its darkest night. The fragile thread of survival was woven not from strength, but from kindness, and that thread continues still, binding us all to those first fires, those first hands held against the cold. Connection over isolation, resilience over despair. This is how we endured. Beneath the calm surface of our modern world, the earth still breathes. Its heartbeat is measured not in seconds or years, but in millennia. Continents drift, plates collide, magma moves unseen beneath our feet. The same forces that shaped Toba 74,000 years ago remain quietly at work. Immense, slow, and largely beyond our control. Today, the scars of that ancient eruption are still visible. In northern Sumatra, the lake that fills the old caldera stretches nearly 100 kilometers across. Serene, blue, and deceptively peaceful. Fishermen cast their nets upon waters that once boiled with fire. Villages line the shores. Tourists come to see the beauty of the place. Few pause to imagine the power that once reshaped the sky above it. The earth has many such places. They appear tranquil, lakes, valleys, fields, yet they are the sleeping hearts of supervolcanoes. Yellowstone in North America, Taupo in New Zealand, Aira in Japan, Campiflegre near Naples. Each lies atop vast magma systems, reservoirs of molten rock stretching deep into the crust. Their existence is a reminder that beneath the order of human civilization, a restless planet still stirs. A supervolcano is not a mountain that erupts often. It is a wound that heals slowly, and sometimes reopens. Toba's last great eruption was not its first. Yellowstone has erupted 3 times in the past 2 million years. Taupo has awakened repeatedly, reshaping the landscape of New Zealand again and again. These events are rare, separated by spans longer than all of recorded history. But rarity does not mean impossibility. Somewhere, deep beneath our world, pressure builds grain by grain, molecule by molecule, over thousands of quiet years. And scientists, with the instruments of our age, listen for its rhythm. Across Yellowstone, arrays of sensors measure the tremors that ripple through the ground. Satellites track minute rises and falls in the land, mere centimeters that might signal movement below. Gas samples reveal the chemistry of unseen chambers. Each observation adds a fragment to the puzzle of prediction. But the truth remains humbling. We do not fully understand the timing of such colossal events. We can measure, we can model, we can prepare, but we cannot command the Earth to remain still. Even with all our knowledge, the line between safety and upheaval remains uncertain. If another supervolcano were to awaken today, the consequences would be global. Modern technology has bound our world together through trade, communication, and dependence. But that same connection means that disruption in one part would ripple everywhere else. Ash clouds could darken skies across continents. Air travel would cease. Crops would fail as sunlight dimmed and temperatures dropped. Supply chains would fracture. Economies would strain. The climate could cool by several degrees for years. And yet, despite the scale of such a scenario, humanity would not face it as our ancestors did. We now have tools they could never have imagined: knowledge, communication, cooperation on a planetary scale. We can monitor, model, and respond. We can share resources, relocate populations, and coordinate aid. But even with all this, the fundamental truth remains. We live on a fragile surface above forces beyond our design. This fragility is not cause for fear, but for perspective. The planet is ancient. Its cycles of destruction and renewal long predate us and will long outlast us. We exist for a brief span in the quiet between cataclysms, an interval of warmth, air, and stability that allows civilization to flourish. To recognize this is not to despair, but to understand our place within the greater rhythm of the Earth. Each day, deep beneath Yellowstone, magma shifts in slow, silent convection. Each year, gases seep upward from vents, marking subtle changes in the subterranean world. Scientists watch, not to predict the impossible, but to learn, to understand how these vast systems behave, and to ensure that when signs come, we can read them clearly. So far, what they see is calm. No sign of imminent eruption, only the quiet pulse of geothermal life. Geysers, hot springs, fumaroles, the Earth exhaling softly through its pores. Still, the question lingers, unspoken but present. Could it happen again? The honest answer is yes. Someday, somewhere, another eruption of such scale will occur. It may not be in our lifetime. It may not be in the next 1,000 generations. But the Earth's history guarantees that it will happen again. To some, that thought invites fear. To others, humility. We are a species that has learned to peer into the planet's heart, to measure and map its hidden fires. But for all our progress, we remain guests upon its surface. Perhaps what matters is not when the next eruption comes, but how we live in the time before it. How we use knowledge not only to protect ourselves, but to foster respect for the system that sustains us. How we build societies that can endure not through dominance, but through adaptability. The story of Toba is not just one of devastation, it is one of renewal. The Earth recovers, life returns, and humanity, fragile, persistent, resilient, continues to learn from what once nearly erased it. In the quiet halls of research stations, in the data streaming from satellites, and in the calm reflections of those who study the deep Earth, a single awareness endures. We live atop a living planet. It moves, it breathes, it changes, and we, for all our mastery, are still a part of its vast experiment. Far beneath us, magma flows in dark chambers miles deep. It will rise again someday, perhaps not violently, but inevitably. For now, though, the surface holds. The air is clear, the skies are blue. Civilization hums, fragile, luminous, temporary, and as night falls across the continents, the Earth sleeps once more. The volcanoes rest, the tremors fade into silence. Yet in that silence, the same power that shaped our beginnings waits, patient and eternal. The story of Toba, of Yellowstone, of every caldera that breathes beneath our world, is not a warning alone. It is a reminder that creation and destruction, life and loss, are inseparable parts of the same long rhythm. The ground beneath our feet is both cradle and crucible, and we, its children, are witnesses to its calm between storms. Knowledge grants comfort, but never certainty. Science grants vigilance, but not control. Between those limits, humanity must learn to live with respect, with curiosity, and with the quiet understanding that we are not separate from the Earth's deep pulse, but born of it. So the question, could it happen again, is less about prediction than perspective. Yes, it could, but so too could life begin again afterward. It always has. It always will. And tonight, as the world rests above its unseen fires, that knowledge, both humbling and reassuring, is enough. Night falls once more across the planet. The cities dim, the noise recedes, and the air cools. Above, the same stars that once shone upon a world of ash still glow in their distant silence. Somewhere, far away from the lights of civilization, the sky looks as it did 74,000 years ago. The same constellations rise and fade, the same moon drifts through its quiet cycles. The world beneath has changed beyond recognition. Forests replaced by fields, stone tools by satellites, but the heavens remain. Calm and unbroken, it is here, beneath this same sky, that the story of Toba ends, or rather, continues, because its ending is not written in the ash it left behind, but in us. There was a time when those stars shone through a veil of darkness, when sunlight was swallowed by clouds of sulfur and dust, when the earth grew cold and silent, and the air itself carried the taste of fire. Yet even then, beneath that dim and alien sky, a few small fires still burned. They flickered in caves, in coastal shelters, in the hollow of human hands. And around them, voices whispered stories to keep fear at bay. Those fires are gone now, their smoke long dispersed. But their light endures in every dawn that follows, in every word spoken from one generation to the next. The warmth that once shielded a handful of survivors now radiates across a planet of billions. The Toba eruption was an ending for many forms of life, but it was also a beginning. In the crucible of catastrophe, humanity discovered what it truly was, a species defined not by power, but by endurance, by memory, by care. When we look back at that near extinction, we see not only the fragility of existence, but the resilience that rises from it. We are here because they stayed. Because, in the darkest winter the world has ever known, someone still believed in another morning. This realization humbles more than it frightens. It reminds us that the distance between survival and extinction can be measured not only in climate or chance, but in compassion, in the simple act of staying together when the world turns cold. The Earth has always carried both destruction and renewal in its depths. Volcanoes create the very land we walk upon. The minerals in our bones were once forged in their heat. Ash becomes soil. Fire becomes life. Each eruption, no matter how terrible, is part of a longer pattern, the same cycle that has shaped continents, oceans, and skies. To live within it is not to fear it, but to understand that we, too, are part of that ongoing rhythm. Look up again at the stars. Their light began its journey long before the eruption, before even the first humans walked the plains of Africa. Some of those photons have traveled for tens of thousands of years, through the darkness of space, through the long winter of Toba, to reach your eyes tonight. They are the universe's quiet testament that even across immense time, brightness endures. Perhaps that is the deeper message hidden in the ashes, that continuity, though fragile, persists, that what begins in chaos can end in calm, that every dawn, however small, is the answer to a night that once seemed endless. We live now in a world unrecognizable to those first survivors. Our homes are warmed by power, not flame. Our food arrives from fields we will never see. Our voices travel invisibly across oceans and sky. And yet, beneath it all, the same ancient instinct remains: to seek warmth, to share stories, to reach for light. In every quiet act of connection, we echo the fires of those who came before us. When we hold a child's hand, when we light a candle in the dark, when we speak kindly to one another, we repeat the same gesture that carried humanity through the ash. Civilization may seem permanent, but it too is only another fire, one that must be tended, shared and protected. The lesson of Toba is not that we are powerless, but that we are temporary, and therefore precious. Every clear sky, Every warm breath, every unbroken day is the continuation of a story that nearly ended before it began. And yet, even with that knowledge, we need not live in fear. For fear closes, understanding opens. The Earth's power is vast, but so is our capacity for meaning. To recognize our fragility is to recognize our worth. If the volcano sleeps again, let it be. If it wakes, we will endure as we always have, not through dominance, but through connection. The same empathy that once warmed a frozen camp will guide us still. Because survival is not a victory over nature, but a partnership with it, a rhythm shared, not conquered. The story of Toba does not end with fire, nor with ash, but with reflection, a reminder that everything we are, every language, every thought, every heartbeat, is the continuation of those few who refused to vanish. Beneath the quiet night sky, their legacy hums within us. It hums in the pulse of cities, in the laughter of children, in the soft hum of machines orbiting above. The world they saved has become a chorus of voices, a civilization built upon memory. And though the earth may someday tremble again, though the sky may darken once more, humanity has learned how to carry its own light. Not a fire of destruction, but of remembrance, a small, steady flame against the immensity of time. When the wind passes over Lake Toba now, it whispers across the same waters that once glowed red with molten rock. The air smells of rain, not sulfur. The forests have returned, green and dense. Life, uncountable and untroubled, moves through the branches. What was once a scar is now a mirror, reflecting the sky, the clouds, and the endless motion of the world. And in that reflection lies a quiet promise, that even after ruin, beauty remains possible. So tonight, as you listen beneath the stillness, imagine those first survivors long ago, the cold around them, the faint crackle of fire, the hush between one heartbeat and the next. In that silence, something extraordinary endured. The will to continue, the refusal to disappear. It is that same will that hums beneath our own lives today. The earth will change again, as it always has. Mountains will rise, oceans will fall, skies will darken and clear. But as long as there is warmth in one hand reaching for another, the thread remains unbroken. Ashes fall, but stars endure. Night deepens, but dawn returns. And beneath the quiet sky, humanity continues. Fragile, enduring, awake.